I'll just record.
Okay, perfect.
All right. And so, wait, I'm not sharing my screen. All right. And so, as I was saying, behaviors that are atypical in autism can very frequently be okay and at certain not show themselves at certain age groups. So it becomes complicated. And as you were saying, Janice, that there are many kids who are not identified until late or very late. Mine actually next door neighbor has autism spectrum disorder, and he was not identified until adulthood. So like that is an ongoing issue related to early identification. Autism can be reliably diagnosed by 18 months to 2 years of age. Most severe ASD is identified by 3 years, and there's a fair amount of variation according to sociodemographic groups. But when we talk about early identification, most estimates are based on 8 years in terms of like how many kids in the community have an autism spectrum disorder, right? So when we think of some of the cases you're noting in your work, that some kids identified in high school may not be making it into these official estimates, and so some of these estimates may be under identifying. A lot of our work here at the center is focused on, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? How do we know we're finding kids with autism? How do we know that we're measuring traits? How do we know we're not measuring personality? And some of those issues related to that drove my initial work in this area. More recently, I moved from work on traits to thinking through some of the systems. How are kids found in their communities? And so when we think through early identification, one of the first systems a child is likely to engage is the Part C early intervention systems. And they have a whole model of early identification that is developed in order to find youth with autism and other developmental disabilities. And so at the top of this, you see child find efforts, assessment services, and ultimate an IFSP, or treatment receipt. We'll focus more on these kind of bottom areas as these really sort of get into the nitty-gritty of what is happening as kids are identified in their communities. And you can think of kind of broad efforts as community-based monitoring and screening, or essentially systems that may be set in place to flag kids who may or may not have an autism spectrum disorder. And so so a system might be set up, so it could be something as simple as, the screening that a doctor gives, he enters it into a medical system, and then that's how we look for kids in this community. But another community might provide intensive training to early child care providers, or intensive training to medical providers, or a variety of trainings within the community, some of which are formal screening, but others of which are maybe how do you look for behaviors that are a little outside of the norm. And so not every community sets up the same kind of concern monitoring approach as other communities. My clicker's not working. There we go. Kids are typically either what is called screen positive, or there's a concern raised, and then there is a referral is then made to some sort of service, right? And so this could be Part C early intervention. It could be a community person who does clinical assessments. Then the next major kind of milestone in this process is that a child is assessed, right? So a clinician sees them, the person determines whether or not they have a condition like autism or not. And then within Part C early intervention, they're assessed eligible. Do they meet the criteria to receive services? Do they not? If you're talking about just a diagnosis, it's does a child meet the DSM criteria for an autism spectrum service or not? And ultimately, a child may or may not enter some sort of services or treatment receipt. And so this model is very much focused on a Part C system, but it can be thought of as more broadly. And did we have any questions? And so this is a very systems-focused, early childhood special education focused model. When we talk about this early identification world, we're really talking about the convergence of a variety of different fields in terms of what do we mean when we talk about early identification of an autism spectrum disorder. And so from epidemiology perspective, you have people in public health who will talk about the number of children who have autism, who are early identified. And then from psychometrics, you'll have perspectives where they talk about the tools or the screeners or the assessment tools that people use to identify youth. And then you have a growing systems perspective, which the model that we just looked at kind of is the perspective that takes. So we start thinking through what these different fields tend to focus on. We have in epi, you have this very narrow focus on clinical diagnoses, that box there, or in purple. So these are actual cases and counts of cases of children who have been identified with an autism spectrum disorder. So work in that literature does not tend to focus so much on the process per se, but a downstream result of a process of early identification. More work is starting to look at not just the diagnosis, but also from national surveys and available data sets. More interest is looking into how many kids are receiving screening, how many children are reporting, or family members are reporting that their child has been screened or monitored. And so when we talk about monitoring, this refers to a fairly informal approach wherein community providers interested in child behavioral health ask parents about their concerns. Medical doctors might keep a record or ask for observations and look for risk and protective factors. Developmental screening, on the other hand, is more formal, and it requires the provision of a brief, informal questionnaire typically provided by healthcare professionals. And there's a variety of instruments available. Popularly, the Ages and Stages questionnaire or the MCHAT are kind of two popular screeners that many healthcare providers use. And those are the first kind of wave of psychometric instruments that are used in early identification. So when we start talking about in the field of early identification, whereas epidemiology is typically focused very narrowly on either counts of diagnoses or number of kids receiving screening or monitoring, psychometric studies tend to look at the relationship between these boxes. And kind of, they may look at a tool and see how accurate is it at identifying which children ultimately receive an autism spectrum disorder, and ultimately receive that box D kind of condition. The ongoing issue that we run into is that historically, when we talk about early identification work, most of it is kind of from this epi standpoint or screening tool focused work, right? So very narrow, typically clinicians doing research on a tool they developed. So they may say, I made this autism screening tool, now I want to test it to see if it correlates with other tools. and then see if it actually finds kids who have an autism spectrum disorder. It tends to be very focused there. There's very little, very, very little out there on the process itself, these multiple steps. So a lot of focus on the boxes, not much focus on the process itself. And so that's where a lot of the work we're doing, and as we think through working with different community-based providers, to really think through what information do we need, what information matters. It really matters, the model that you use really matters. If you're thinking of this from a psychometric perspective, you'll focus on just a few of these boxes. But we really need to take into consideration the whole breadth of moving from initial concern all the way to treatment receipt. And so we've been doing a variety of work in our center, kind of starting to flesh out, does this make sense? And so we've done some work looking at screening and treatment receipt, looking at just how many kids are receiving screening in the United States and in Georgia, and then showing that indeed, when you start looking at screening and monitoring, there's a relationship between that and whether youth ultimately receive treatment. And so there's been a few studies that we've been doing related to that. And we have some ongoing psychometric work that we continue to invest in, because that perspective is still important. This model is proven to be very, very flexible and useful. And so one of the things that we've done more recently is we have a grant to look at not just treatment receipt, but actually starting to move that box down to looking at the relationship between screening and monitoring and clinical diagnoses. And as part of this research, we had an interesting finding, which basically showed that Black children and Hispanic children had lower odds of receiving both screening and monitoring compared to white children. And Black children and other race children had higher odds of receiving no screening or monitoring. Well, we found this interesting relationship where essentially this variable called usual source of care did what's called mediated the relationship between race and whether a child receives screening and monitoring, which essentially indicated that that Black and Hispanic children who had a usual source of care, that is a doctor or a healthcare provider that they see regularly, had no difference in their rates of screening and monitoring. But those who don't have a usual source of care actually have lower rates. So that usual source of care, healthcare engagement piece is really important. And we'll kind of talk about that in a minute in terms of how we've started to adjust our model and think through ways to work with healthcare systems to try to improve early identification processes. So in relationship to autism, as we think through all these pieces, and I know this is a lot, we'll probably stop here for a minute and give people an opportunity to ask a couple of questions or leave if they feel like they need to. But it lends itself to developing interventions that are not just focused on referrals or not just focused on increasing kids that get assessments, but ultimately the whole, again, that whole swath of things, of the whole swath of the process of early identification all the way to treatment and ultimately to ongoing lifespan needs. So here, the yellow arrows point to places where systems-based interventions will need to look to provide support in navigating complex systems. So the history of this work has focused on the big boxes, right? Are kids getting screened and monitored? Yes or no? Are kids getting referred? Yes or no? Are they receiving an assessment? Are they receiving a diagnosis? Are they receiving treatment? All these are important pieces And each one of those boxes has its own world of research and work that goes into it related to tool development and all the way on to the treatment end, right? There's tons of different specific treatments that are created and all sorts of interventions that have been developed over time. Cindy, you're getting an ABA. So like there's this whole field of treatment, right? That you can do this style of positive behavior supports, or you can do this type of intervention. And all of those happen within, a lot of those happen within systems themselves that have their own data collection and their own monitoring that goes on for ongoing needs. So we talk about, so our center is currently thinking through ways to develop interventions that aim not just to collect these data points, these the blue arrows kind of going up and down to the boxes are the data points that we tend to look at, that they get referred. But also these orange arrows, I think, are really an important piece that are missed as we talk through this. These are the cracks in the system where there may be concerns, there may be referrals, there may be appointments made, but people don't go, they get missed out, they fall through the cracks. These are some of the cracks in the system where we are losing opportunities to find kids with autism. And so as we develop kind of systems-based intervention, this model helps us think through how to engage this. So for example, we're looking at some case management interventions to think through engaging systems, right? So if you hired a case manager who then follows up with parents and ensures not just that they get referred, but they actually make it to the place they're referred to. And if they can't make it to the place they're referred to, how do you problem solve with them? How do you essentially provide wraparound supports to engage connection between the system pieces, right? And so this is a place where I think that there will be a lot of growth in the near future and opportunities in Georgia and other places for us to use this to think through, all right, well, we're going to work with Part C or early intervention, or we're going to work with DECAL, or we're going to work with Part C and a community hospital that really need to communicate with each other, but for some reason, there are policy issues that are preventing connection and conversations from occurring. And so I'm going to stop right here for a second and stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions. And if they're not, don't worry about it. And if there are, we'd be happy to field them. Yes. Cindy, oh, sorry, you can't see me.
I was wondering, when you look at Black or African American children, learners, and when you look at the Hispanic learners who are not being identified early, is there a correlation between the fact that they're not being identified early and perhaps their state of poverty and or their geographical location?
That's a good question. So
can I just jump in there a moment too, to say that where I am, I've got, I guess, a related question, because we do not have a very large African American or Hispanic population where I am, but we do have abject poverty. So I'm interested in how that all correlates.
That's a great question. So, I mean, so some of the work we're doing, as a matter of fact, I have a manuscript I'm writing right now where we're looking at national survey data, looking essentially at the relationship between screening and monitoring and race and ethnicity related to early identified autism children under 5. And so as part of that, we're trying to look at this piece from this model perspective, because you have the dominant narrative, which I think is a dominant narrative because it is clearly true, that there are healthcare access inequities, right? I mean, so if you're not in the system, you're probably not getting screened, and you're probably, you know, and so you're there's all sorts of things you don't have access to. And so then that model I showed you earlier helps build out that perspective, which showed that for screening and monitoring for this health service, right? So pediatricians provide this as a healthcare service, that you have disparities in receipt. But it seems to be primarily driven by the fact that that Black and Hispanic populations had a lower usual source of care. They were less likely to have a pediatrician they regularly attended or talked their child to. So for Black and Hispanic family or populations, I guess because this is a national survey data, for Black and Hispanic families that have a usual source of care, their screening and monitoring rates did not differ. But it was for those that did not have a source of care that their screening and monitoring rates differed, right? And so that's an important piece because it points to a very important narrative that there is a fundamental inequity related to healthcare access, right? And this is not a surprising finding, right? I mean, this is a well-known reality as part of our presidential debates. Like, this is a fundamental, it's institutional racism, right? I mean, it's an ongoing issue. It's interesting. Just before this, I got into we have a grant that we're writing related from a psychometrics perspective, and within psychometrics, as you make an instrument, there are ways to test if an instrument can be used equally across race and ethnicities. And it's called measurement invariance. And so essentially, it looks at things like, do the items correlate similarly? Does the instrument predict who has autism similarly across race and ethnic groups or different? I mean, you can pick the groups. It doesn't have to be race and ethnicity. But the work in that area is fairly low related to really vetting these instruments before they roll out and they're used in a widespread manner. As a matter of fact, there was a study that came out in pediatrics at the very end of 2019. It showed that the MCHAT, which is really popular early autism screener, that when you follow up on false negatives, or essentially the children the screener said, oh, this kid doesn't have a problem, right? That when you follow up with those cases, that actually it misses a lot of children, and actually it misses slightly more minority children than it does white children. It actually missed a whole bunch of all children, but there were some discrepancies in how and whether it found kids or not. And so you really look at, I know I feel like I'm going on and on. This is actually one of my it's an area I really like to talk about. But we don't think of instrument development in terms of in terms of racist or like race oriented, at least. We don't, but frequently these tools are developed on majority populations, and then they're rolled out to everyone. And there may be some small studies, clinical studies here and there, that start to look at how the instruments, after it's been rolled out, how does this instrument now work in this population or this population? It's like, oh, wow, it doesn't work as well. You could actually create a similar model for what are the steps that an instrument should go through before it's recommended for everyone, right? And which groups, and has it really been tested with a large sample? Has it psychometrics been tested in a group of African Americans and in a group of Hispanic folks and a group of this group or that group? At what point is it really safe to say that it's good for it works for all people? And so actually, I was literally from before this, I was on a grant call where we're looking at some data to essentially look at a popular screener and backtrack, because some colleagues of mine found that it did not have, it was not as accurate in Black and Hispanic populations. And so essentially the next question we're asking is, well, how can we fix that? Because you can think of like early identification is like multiple leaky sieves that don't work well for everyone. And it's like some kids fall out, and they're falling out at different rates. And so it's not that all kids are under-identified at the same rate. And so we're trying to think through some of that with some of the data sets we have access to. I'll let you. I'm going to say one more thing, but it really, what I just said about what we're looking at is really points to the need for these different fields to talk together, because psychometrics typically is related to psychology and clinical studies, and a lot of times, and they tend towards, they may have like a few hundred cases, but it's really expensive to do the studies, and frequently they you may not have large enough sample sizes to do the kind of studies that need to be done. And public health, though, frequently has these very large samples, but often don't have the item level information that is required to do the psychometric piece. And so there's actually a few data sets starting to come out where they're very large population studies that actually have item level information, but they're in public health. But I'm a psychologist by training, and so like I'm like, oh wow, this is great. So we can actually have these items that we can test that was not the original purpose of the data collection. So thank you for that question.
So Brian,
Yeah.
So in my experience as a parent, so for example, the first year and all the diagnosis, I didn't understand it, but like the following year, to me, I don't know if I can put a lot of weight on the measures as much, because I can clearly see improvements, but then the scores were not moving up. And so, to the clinician, they're still listing all the severe impairments, but to me as a parent, I'm not seeing as much of that severe impairment anymore. And sometimes I ask myself, where's the disconnect?
That's a great question. I mean, that's interesting. And so, so I don't know what instrument, and I'm not, I need to be clear, I'm not a clinician. And so I tend to, there are instruments used for diagnosis. There's instruments used for research. I mean, there's a variety of different tools used. But I can share an experience I had when I was a special ed teacher that helps me frame sometimes the kind of reality experienced by the person working with a child versus where a child falls in a population, right? So clinicians are used to thinking of not just the personal experience, but how this child appears compared to the majority of children, which are what these tools are normed on. So it's like a population distribution. So I worked with a young man who had emotional behavioral disturbances when I was a special ed teacher, and at the beginning of the school year when he came to me, we were dealing with a lot of cursing and throwing desks and punching and just very physically aggressive. And so thinking of all of his peers, he was way out here, and he was a very aggressive young man. And so over the course of working with him, we moved those behaviors from almost no physical by mid-year. A lot of cursing still, a lot of yelling, stomping off, running off in the hallway. And if you charted his behavior individually, he made great gains. And very proud of the work we did with him. But if we did a rating scale on him compared to his peers, he would still be very elevated. And so most of these tools are based on a normal distribution of behavior seen typically for kids in a very narrow age range. And so while I was personally very proud of the work he had invested and on all that had gone into creating that behavior change, if I gave him like the child behavior checklist and it asked, does your child frequently, does this child frequently curse? Yes. He would have gone low on the physical aggression. He would have stayed high on verbal aggression. He would have stayed high on, I'm not sure where stomping off or that would have gone in there. And he may have still received an elevated score on the overall score that would put him above his peers on average. And so that, I don't know if that's this particular situation, but that was my experience. That was an experience I had that might help speak to that. Does that help?
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, it helps, and I do understand, the norm scores and stuff like that. I just feel like the whole psychometric stuff, in as much as it guides, I think the kind of focus on it a lot by a lot of people is not helpful to parents who may not understand what those mean anyways.
Yes.
Because some of those metrics, they're only as good as the time it's given. And there's so many variations that can go into it: the mood of the child, the mood of the person administering it.
That's
because I have the same conversation. I mean, I'm in a great school system and I have great teachers. I left shortly because one of them just stopped by to see my son. But even with them, when they do all the scores, they're like, well, this does not reflect him, but this is what came out, and this must just have been a bad day. And so obviously with my background, they do take the time to explain it to me. But for those many parents out there who do not have that same advantage, it's problematic.
Yes.
And it could also be the reason why some parents are not even bothering to even take their child to be seen, because they can't make sense out of it.
It's I see what you're saying there, and it's an interesting area. Again, I'm more of a researcher, but in this world of early identification research, I think it is really interesting that clinicians themselves are not the object of research more often related to this. And so some of the stuff we've done, we had a really interesting, in one of our analyses we did a while back, we were looking at scores on a major autism assessment. And one of the main predictors that came out that we didn't expect, and somebody just had suggested that we put it in, was the site where a person was assessed. And there were a few different sites, and it ended up accounting for a lot of the variance across scores. And so this, I don't want to get too far into like kind of the stats weeds, but there are a variety of designs where you can start looking at the actual kind of clinicians themselves as nesting variables. That, so if clinician A does assessments on all of these kids and clinician B does assessments on these other kids or the same kids, you can try to figure out, are there kind of patterns in how people assess kids that differ from one another? Because you're right, some of these tools are very complicated, and there are qualitative decisions that have to be made along the way of how to categorize a behavior, and there's drift sometimes from training, and there's all these factors that can affect things. And you start to think of someone who goes to the Marcus Autism Center to get trained for their graduate training. They go into the school systems and they've had this intensive training around autism, but maybe another school psychologist went to an ADHD clinic and had some training related to autism, but more training related to ADHD, and maybe were trained on a particular instrument. And then maybe somebody else has like a different degree or background, and they're doing assessments. So there could be some training effects. I mean, it is complicated. So I think that's a really interesting thought. And there is some work. There's a few studies that I'm aware of related to clinician bias. But I think that they're from Europe, though. So I don't think that's been done as frequently in the United States as the one that comes to mind is Big Ear et al. About a decade ago.
And that was my question that I was going to ask Brian concerning instrumentation that could measure that bias, or at least some type of observation to measure the possible bias of the clinicians or the particular location or anything like that. Or do we just go into this just with an assumption that everyone did a great job and all of those good particular things? You see, I see this as having a tremendous impact on the level of services that individuals receive, impact the quality of life of individuals.
Yeah.
I think that as long as we've been doing this in this address bias, whether
you're breaking up.
intended or institutional or whichever way,
Right.
that should be.
I missed part of that. Would you mind repeating the kind of rephrase? I mean, you kind of broke up for a second.
Yeah, well, in my thinking, I believe there should be some things in place that helps to identify bias, whether it's in instrumentation or the clinician, whichever end of it that it is, because of the impact of that diagnosis over the lifespan of individuals.
Yeah,
and
I mean, that
makes it different, you know.
I think that would be an interesting. I mean, that seems like an interesting. To me, that seems like a very interesting line of research. Where you could potentially even, measure do an implicit bias test or something along those lines, implicit or a rating explicit bias, and look to see how it relates to scoring on different assessments. And actually, I've talked through with different people about designing things like that before. The biggest issue is finding people that will fund it before, because it would be a very expensive study when we start talking about in terms of, but I think that's a great idea. I think that would be a fascinating thing to look at. I think you get into these, we start bringing in the race piece or even the ethnicity piece and the potential biases. It becomes very thorny very quick, right? And you've got institutionalized issues related to race and socioeconomic status and whatnot. And then you've got potentially even, if we talk about, you could potentially frame psychometrics and the design of an instrument before it goes to rollout for a community within a framework along those lines. And then you have the potential hidden realities or trained realities, right? Of people, whether or not they are explicitly biased or not, depending on where they are on that world, it becomes very thorny. I imagine it becomes I don't have to imagine it, it's thorny to tease apart and then also deal with. I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you so much. I think LaTanya had a question, and then I can get you, Cindy. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay, then we'll do LaTanya, Cindy, and then Janice.
Okay, my question is, are there any instruments out there that are better than others that take into account the racial bias or disparities? If so, are they widely used? And if not, why?
That's a good question. So there has been some research. So we have a nice little bibliography of things we started to put together. And I mainly look at screening tools. And so we are just in the beginning stages of looking at some of that. But my sense, based on, some of the work I've done, is that there is some work, but tools tend to be rolled out for use prior to that work being done. It's not part of the instrument development. It's frequently post hoc. It's frequently like, oh, we have this tool, people should use it. And then people start testing it and say, well, it works great for white middle-class kids, right? or like, or middle-class people generally, or, you know, but not in this group or that group or that group, right? And so and some of it has to do with funding, and some of it has to do with the sample size required to do some of these studies is very large. So they're not easy, they're expensive. So my experience, there's a lot of work related to translation of tools, particularly for Latinx populations, and then some more sizable things related to that. But my sense is that it's not at the forefront of the development of tool. And I personally kind of think it would be good to be at the forefront, that a tool is not considered ready until you've had a really good, you know, solid, very large N sample sensitivity specificity study done on a larger population. So that's what I think, you know. All right, Cindy.
Oh, I just wanted to say one thing. There have been research studies that have looked at maybe special ed teachers versus general education teachers. And in terms of child behavior, some research seems to indicate that special ed teachers are actually more picky as far as the behavior they expect. And the theory behind that is that perhaps they're looking at later on the child being included in general education, and they want that child to be successful. But see, I think when we go back to the identification puzzle, I think that we have a wide variety of ideas depending upon, like you said before, our areas of specialty, our own experiences, etc. And I think all of this plays in to why we're not identifying the children early like we should be. Yeah,
I think that's a good point. That's we've got a couple of minutes. I think Jareen's going to force us out of this room in just about 3 minutes. So it's this is a wonderful discussion, though. Janice, go ahead and.
Yeah, I think this is not so much a question as just a comment. So knowing that in the situation I find myself in, like I said, there has not been a lot of good early identification of certain types of, especially young men who end up with an autism diagnosis. And I've been interested to try and work out for our community why that's been the case. And I think one of the things that I have unearthed is by talking to parents that culturally, in what we might, and this is not politically correct, and I'm not going to apologize, but it's a poor white community, a lot of what we might call trailer trash. There's a lot of racism towards the African American and towards the Hispanic community. But here's what the parents will say, that when faced with certain questionnaires or screenings, they will deliberately minimize and underreport things out of suspicion and mistrust. The authority, the school, healthcare, and also they appear to be horribly misinformed about autism. So for example, and this is just one case, a parent and a child who did not want to talk about it or get services because they knew that the child would die before becoming an adult because it's a degenerative disease. So there's all these strange and wonderful things that are
really interesting, and
part of that.
I think it's that. So I will probably be cut off, so I'm gonna have to. But you know, it looks like I have a choice. You guys, it's closing in 54 seconds. All right. So it's interesting because I mentioned you were bringing the Scots-Irish piece into this, but it is interesting to think the long-standing effects of institutionalized systems on cultures and what you're. I mean, so you look at. I don't think we'll have time for this, but like
Great job, though.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So Georgia started as a penal colony, largely for Scots-Irish folks who had a large distrust of the government. And some of that could be cultural pieces playing out that is like 250 years later. And I used to talk about some of the other differences in terms of like Scots-Irish aren't the only people who distrust authority sometimes, and probably with good reason.
I learned a lot from the conversation, and made me think in a lot of different perspectives that I don't usually think in.
Yeah.
And so I think it went well, and I think Kayla and Susan did a great job covering it.
Yay! It was fun for sure, and we learned a lot. I learned from them, and we had a great conversation.
That's great. Yay, that is so great to hear. And we're going to reach out. We sent the link for like the overall conference evaluation for last week, but we're going to be sending out separate evaluations for the lunch discussions, because we would love to hear y'all's feedback on this process as well. I'm liking it.
I am loving it. I was going to ask you, when is the recording, or is it already available from the main Autism Expo?
So it's one huge recording, so we have to figure out how to edit that, because we would prefer to break it down in chunks and have the different presentations separate instead of sharing a whole video. So that is to be determined when we'll be able to edit it. Recording. We have a resource, but they're not available till June to start tackling it and breaking up the video for us. We have another option where we could try to take a stab at it. I think we have some software that we could try, but not sure how that would turn out. So do you have any?
Why don't we talk? I was going to say, why don't we talk offline and see if that's another invoice that the grant can help to support you to do that.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I will reach out. I will reach out for sure. Okay. Any other thoughts on your experience? Brian, this was your first time doing the breakout. Joe, it's good to see you again. I see your video now.
Hey, Jareen, I know I wasn't supposed to do the recording, but I had to like request permission from Brian, so he just ended up recording it himself. So grab the recording from him.
Okay. That's interesting that you had, because that happened to Evelyn yesterday too, but I think you were a co-host.
It happened to Taylor too. I had to assign Taylor permission to record.
I'm not sure why that's happening, but thank you for letting me know that. And that's something I'll look into for next week, because I assumed, and we practiced it, that any co-host would be able to record, but I'm not sure why it's having you guys ask for permission.
Yeah.
There might be a settings. I heard Zoom reset their settings last week and if you go to zoom.us, like ours is Emory.zoom.us, and then there's a settings and it says only allow the host or not co-host to might be in there too.
I'll look into it. Thank you for letting me know, because that happened with Evelyn yesterday as well.
Yeah, during Maya's presentation, she wasn't able to make me co-host, so she just recorded it. So hers from yesterday.
Yeah, my recording got lost. When I closed it down, it never got recorded.
Oh, really?
I did get a notification of a recording on my computer, but I didn't hit record, so maybe we'll see. I'll look to see what I have on my computer. I saved it under lunch discussion, so I'll see what's under there and see if any of those recordings came to my computer, which I don't know why that would happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's weird.
Well,
so Brian, how did yours go?
Brian?
I thought so I was going to actually say one thing that I think might be useful if we can do it is to give the option of extending. So like when it basically kind of pops up and says, Jareen shutting this down in a minute. And I saw the 5-minute warning, but we got on a roll, or maybe I got on a roll. You guys can. The conversation was rolling. Let's just put it that way, and it was very enjoyable. And I'm sorry to hear it. For it to come. it's come to an end, but it's also true I was speaking when it came to an end. So maybe that's the problem.
That happened to me yesterday too,
Yeah.
because it's just, like it says 5 minutes, and then before you know it, you see the countdown happening, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do it, and then you're cut off. So yeah, there's no way that I know Zoom can like extend it, but you can always say, what I told my participants was that, we'll all get transitioned into the main room. So if you have any further conversations or questions that you want to ask me, I'll hang around in the main room a little bit longer. So you see, like, it's closed, but anyone who had further questions, you guys could stay here, have conversations. So that's one thing I can mention. I forgot to mention it today, but that's something I can mention next week as well.
Yeah. Okay. That would be. Okay. I mean, if anybody wants to stick around for the last, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was like one of those dates where you're really enjoying it and the other person's like ready to leave, but.
Oh, that's awesome.
You were really on a good roll. I was.
Oh, good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it was great.
You did
It was
a great
great,
job,
Brian.
Brian.
It wasn't just you, Brian. He enjoyed it too.
Okay, good.
And I think Musu and Latanya, weren't you guys in Brian's room as well? Yeah.
It was awesome. Yeah, so we were on a
So
roll.
they stuck around, Brian?
What's that? What did you say, Jerry?
They stuck around.
What was the
with
topic,
you?
Brian?
People from your room.
What did you say, Susan?
Well, I appreciate you guys. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, what was the topic?
So we were talking about screening, like early identification, screening, monitoring, and referral. But we were actually in the middle of talking about. We had a lady, so I can't remember her name right now, but who was from a Scots-Irish background, and she had a strong Scottish accent. I mentioned at the beginning, and then she's teaching special ed in rural Georgia, and so part of our conversation was talking through discrepancies, disparities, and differences in early identification, and she was talking about her issues with these youth in their teenage years being identified, who are white rural youth for the most part, and talking with parents, how they will say things, they're distrustful of the government and don't want their child identified for whatever reason. And I was bringing up we tend to think of differences in terms of race, ethnicity, but in institutional and there are institutional race and ethnic considerations. But one thing to kind of consider for Georgia is it started as a Scots-Irish penal colony, and some of the culture. There was a book called Born Fighting, written by, I think, Virginia's governor like a decade or two ago, who talks about the Scots-Irish experience in the United States. And he talks about what we think of and as kind of lowbrow white culture, right? Kind of is a continuation of some of these lines of cultural thought related to, or like redneck culture would be a good way to think of it. A lot of us probably think of it as Trump. I mean, like all sorts of things that go with it. And we had already talked about identification related to Black and Latino populations and some of those things, but we don't tend to think of that in relationship to not finding white kids. But we were just kind of talking about that and the issues of institutional racism, framing psychometric development in terms of racism itself. Like, tools are rolled out before they're ready for everyone, and then ultimately talking about like cognition bias as a form of racism.
And white.
What's that?
I was just saying, how about the tools are only developed based on white children,
right.
Primarily Caucasian samples.
Yeah.
So if you have a tool developed based on one,
Yeah.
But I think culture is a bigger piece too, which is an interesting, because that's what I always hear from the parents. Is I was always told my kid's just a bad kid, or he's just a boy, or these types of things that we hear so often.
Yeah, and that's, you can think of that in terms of like gender expectations. I'm sorry, go ahead, Musa. Sorry about that.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I said the other layer. So for me, I'm an African immigrant, And I can tell you within our community, there's also that distrust. And the distrust is mostly the fact that these kids get these labels, and these labels carry on for a very long time. And so some parents are scared. And so if you tell them that something is wrong with their child, they're going to push back. Not because they don't want to do what is right for their child. The fact of the matter is that they're scared of that child being labeled, that child being marginalized. And they rather just go like, okay, the teacher is not doing his or her job, as opposed to my child is the problem, or I need to go get help for that child. So that distrust cuts across racial lines.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we hear that through some of our families living in Clarkston, which has a higher Somali population, and just kind of what even culturally, like what is accepted in the culture. And if by getting that, you know, label, then are we then ostracizing them from their community, or are they now, you know what I mean? So those are all things to think about. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I'm sorry I missed that one, Brian.
I know, but it was recorded, right?
It is. Well, we're still recording. So
Brian,
we
get the
I see.
yeah, I guess, yeah. So we can save it for
the only thing about planning. Yes. We'll probably have to do some editing to the lunch discussions too, maybe. We're not sure, but you know, the one thing about conference planning and coordinating is that I don't get to get involved and hear the good stuff. So thank you for sharing, you know, what you talked about, Brian. And I hope that I can watch your video or even pick your brain, because you just, you know, we work together. So
yeah, anytime. And I feel free to reach out. Anybody wants to continue this conversation. I'll give you my number and we can talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all so much. Yeah. That was great.
Thank you, Musu, for being here. I saw your name a couple times. I hope to see you again next week.
Yes, I registered for everything. I'm kind of like trying to learn as much as I can. It's my first time, but I think I'm loving it.
Yes, that's great. Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, Jareen, do you need to stay on?
I'll reach out to you about the editing.
Bye, Latonya. Bye, Joe.
Yeah, let me know. I'll let you and Brian have a discussion.
See you, Latonya. Take care.
See you next week, Latonya. I'm glad you were able to join.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
What do I need to do so I'm going to stop recording, and then what do I need to do?
Are you the one recording right now?
I think so. So like, I don't want to lose it.
So when you stop recording, it's going to